Hello, and welcome to another episode of Real World Analytics, or What Schools Don't Teach You. This is another installment of my coffee series, where I find something interesting and give you my impression in an informal fashion as a data analytics professional. Once again, I found something on LinkedIn. I'll put a copy of it here. This is a report by McKinsey Company, the title of which is The Evolution of Model Risk Management. If you want to read this before hearing my thoughts, I'll put a link in the description below, or you can Google this. Although it's dated February 2017, it's only recently come across my LinkedIn page. And since I've worked in model management before, I thought it'd be a good chance for me to sit down and go through this, give you some insights from a data analytics point of view, but how you can leverage some of this to help your model development and analytics projects in the future. So if you'd like to go read it, if you want to hit the pause button, or if you'd like to get yourself a cup of coffee or some other beverage of your choice, if you hit the pause button, I'll wait for as long as you'd like. So if you've had a chance to read that, very good. It is interesting that this is aimed at management. So if you go through and read it, you need to stop thinking like a data science professional, so that when you come up against numbers or metrics or something else, your first instinct may be to look at it and say, where'd that number come from? Or, well, that's not the metric I would use what? You need to put all that aside and keep reading. It's also important to note that if this is written for management, there's a chance that your management or your business stakeholders have read this or something like it. And so the language that's used here might resonate with your stakeholders a bit more than if you start talking about technical terms. In the interest of full disclosure, the article says that the data were gathered by Risk Dynamics. I have experience with Risk Dynamics. They did a model validation on a model I built. And while I have no existing relationships with them, in the interest of full disclosure, I do know some people with Risk Dynamics. I have had business relationships with them in the past. So while I don't currently have anything like that, I do trust their judgment. I do value their experience as validators. So that's put aside. What do I mean by validators? What does a validation mean? Loosely speaking, a validation consists of three parts. Was the model built correctly? Has it been implemented correctly? And is it still working correctly? By and large, that's a good summary for what's happening with validation. So when you're building a model, you need to ask those questions as to your own model. And if there is an independent validation, you need to be ready for them. So how big is this problem, you may ask? According to the article, models have been growing in number very strongly at banks, growing between 10% and 25% per year. So there's a large number there. There's a lot of things happening. And it goes on to say that there's between 103,000 models at different banks. While that's banks, I think we can all agree that mathematical models, data models are growing rapidly. That's why data science is becoming a big thing, and why I can sit down and informally talk to young data scientists about why these things are important. It also talks about the validation time ranging somewhere between a few days and 30 weeks. Now, most model builds and data analytics jobs I have are much shorter than 30 weeks. So if the validation process can take up to that long, it's in your best interest to make sure it doesn't take that long for you, because it will be a better project and it will make your supervisors happy. And I've heard that a good indication as to whether or not you're a good employee is how often you make your manager happy. So keep that in mind as you're going through a model build, that a lot of what you're doing, in addition to the technical stuff, is about management's perception of you and how easy you make things for management, which is why this is things schools don't teach you. So from the kind of introduction, they talk about a cost reduction of model risk management between 20 and 30%. Now, as I said earlier, this is written for management, and if you want to talk about the things you're doing to your own model to validate them yourself, they might not understand, but if you can reference that it might save them 20 to 30%, suddenly they're going to be more interested. They also talk about the number of people working on models, and models management ranges from 8 to 19 per billion in assets. Now, I want that to be by model, but again, it's not the metric I would use, but taking my own advice, I'm just going to keep going. It talks about what impacts validation time, and it says that 76% of delays are due to poor model documentation, poor model submission, not necessarily the model itself, but the submission around it. And in the footnote, it says that only about 10% are based on a really deep, comprehensive model validation. So if the largest if the bottleneck is making a poor model submission, it's natural to ask, well, how can I make sure my model is not a poor submission? And for this reason, whenever I start a new model or some new analytics work, I don't just start coding, but rather I start an R Markdown document or a Jupyter notebook if you're familiar with them, so that the documentation and the code and the results are all together. Because I know that for many projects, the documentation is the first thing to die. It's the first thing to get cut. So that's where I want to start, so that when I get to the end of my model development, I already have my documentation and I won't be scrounging to get everything together. An interesting thing, again, from a data science perspective, is in the article they talk about metrics that are being used to evaluate models, and only about 20% of institutions are using metrics to validate their models. Now, if you're going through this kind of canonical model build process where you have your training data, you build your model on your training data, and you use the model on your test data, whatever metric you're using there, if you can communicate that to stakeholders and say, these are the metrics I'm using to assess my own model on my own performance, I recommend you use that in the future, so that if you can define these metrics, calculate these metrics, make these metrics real, hopefully your institution won't be one of these 20% that is just kind of using a fuzzy validation, because within analytics and data people, if you can get things down to a number, it becomes much easier. And so if you can convince your stakeholders that this number is appropriate, your job gets a lot easier and a lot more black and white as to whether or not your model is good enough, or whether or not there are reasons why it can't be that good. It further notes that many institutions don't do implementation validation. And this to me is quite scary, because if I build a model, I normally do the algorithmic development, so I don't code things for production as a rule. And so if the production code isn't going to be validated by anyone, I want to try to make that as easy as possible, so that my stakeholders on the implementation side, if I give them not just a model description, but I actually give them test cases and say, here are some example inputs, here's the training data I used, here's the test data I used, here's the code that I used in order to extract the data from the production environment. So if I'm writing a SQL code, I can say I'm getting these values from these tables, and for the new model, I expect things to change like this. Here's the input, here's the old calculation, here's the new calculation based on my new model, and that'll make things a lot smoother, so that when the model gets implemented, there will be assurance that things are done correctly. Now, from the McKinsey report, there are some exhibits, some charts to show what's happening. And the first, there's the different stages of, shall we say, model risk management maturity. And it says that most North American banks are in stage 2, and most European peers are still in stage 1, and they don't mention Australia at all. So you may recall when I was talking about metrics, I said that you can try to convince your stakeholders that the metrics are important. And this is part of what's listed under stage 2 for training your stakeholders. So if you can tell the business why you're doing the model the way you are, why you've constructed it the way you have, what outputs are you looking at, what metrics are you using to assess your model quality, and you can get them across the line on that, that's a great deal. That's what they put in stage 2, but I encourage you to do this for any model build. They're also talking about, in another exhibit, some of the things you can do to facilitate model validation. So having standards. If 76% of model validations are delayed due to poor quality, and you don't have standards, well, that's a little unfair in my opinion. And if there aren't standards, you can frequently talk to the validation team and ask them, do you have a template? Do you have something that I can use to ensure that you have the information you will need so that this entire thing gets wrapped up quickly? Now, sometimes validation units can be a bit coy and say something along the lines of, we only provide comments on a full model delivery. We're not going to give you anything we're not going to give you any opinions on anything other than a full submission. That does happen sometimes, but in my experience it's quite rare. Normally they'll say, well, at a minimum, we expect to see the following. And based on the results of that, we'll probably probe deeper. But if you can get a good starting point and you can get a document template, or at least a minimal viable document template, then you can start writing your document, writing your code, and getting everything going to try to not be one of these 76% of model validations that are slowed down by poor submissions. So in summary, the article concludes that having consistent standards allows 15% of model risk management resources to be conserved. And if you are in that boat, if you are trying to build a model, you want to try to conserve as much of the model risk management resources as you can, because otherwise, when you build the model and one day it's not working properly, you're probably going to be the one to be tapped on the shoulder and asked why. And so for those reasons, if your submission to validation is as high quality as possible, when something goes wrong or when there are questions a few years down the road and you get asked about it, then all of that comes back to you, and that future version of you will be very grateful. And of course, with regulatory pressure building on banks, institutions on both sides of the Atlantic, well, I don't border the Atlantic. The fun parts about living in Australia. So that's my thoughts about this article. As I said, it is a good article. Just make sure you read through it. And it's good to read this type of article, even if you disagree with it, to try to see what management is hearing and how the messaging is done, and try to include some of these terms in your engagement with stakeholders. One of the frequent criticisms about analytics professionals is they don't understand the business. So if you can say, I read this article by McKinsey that talks about these high-level business topics of validation and risk management, maybe you can win some people over if that think, oh, well, okay, you do know something about the business. Or they might say, yeah, go away, you're just an analytics professional. What do you know about business? That's something to keep in mind. So what do you think? Have you had any experiences with validation? Have you had any incidents with model risk management, implementations gone wrong, anything of that nature? If so, I'd like to hear about it. Otherwise, I'll see you next time on Real World Analytics, What Schools Don't Teach You. Thanks for watching.